Hello, pirates. This is Mr. Russell here with my trusty biology partner, Hermosa. She's chewing on a bone. Here to talk to you about the first installment of our 9th objective, which is natural selection and evolution. And we're going to talk about the first part of that today. So let's get started. All right. First of all, we use this acronym VISTA in order to talk about evolution. The word VISTA is Spanish, and it means either to look at something, or it means a beautiful view or something like that, or I guess it doesn't have to be beautiful. Buena Vista is a beautiful view. But yeah, it's to look or a view or something like that. But we actually use it because of the letters are important parts of how species change over time, or at least how we talk about species changing over time. Okay, so the V is for variation that you have in different species. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because we're going to go into each one of these things individually later on. We go into inheritance, which is actually mostly the same thing we've already talked about, but we're going to, I guess, expand upon that a little bit. Talk about selection, how certain organisms are selected. I put that in air quotes because they're not really selected, but we'll talk about that later on, but they're selected to survive and pass on their traits. We'll talk about time, how a lot of time has to pass in order for species to change. And then the last thing that we'll talk about is adaptation, which is the actual changes that you see in species over time. Okay, here's a cool picture that shows what scientists think whales have done over time, how they evolved from land creatures to aquatic marine mammals, and we'll talk in a lot more detail about them later on, but that's just an example. Okay, first thing I want to talk about, and this is actually out of order. I told you Vista. I'm going to start with the I, so it's going to be IVSTA. And as far as what you remember for your test, that's not important. I'm just starting with inheritance because that's what we just finished talking about. So as you know, traits get passed from parent to offspring. And that goes for any living thing. That could be a human, or it could be a tree growing outside, or a cockroach scurrying around in the corner, or the bacteria that live in your intestine. Sorry, I had a couple sneezes there I had to edit out. So anyway, all living things, no matter what they are, get their traits from their parents. Okay, and that is what we talked about last time, and that's what we call inheritance. And that's important because when we're talking about species and how they change over time, obviously traits getting passed from one generation to the next is a very important part of that process. Very important thing you may want to write on the edge of your notes somewhere, I don't think we have it on there specifically, is this idea that all living things have the same goal, and that is to pass on their traits, which basically means to reproduce. So they want to continue on the species, and in order to do that, you have to reproduce. And you may say, what? Living things do all kinds of stuff. They don't spend all their time trying to breed. Well, they do lots of things, but most of those are things that they're really just keeping themselves alive in order to reproduce. Now, humans are a little bit different because we are very smart and have these highly developed brains and also have all this free time because we've kind of mastered the world around us. And so we have other goals and things like that, but in general, living things really just have this one goal, and that would be to make more of themselves, to propagate the species. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about variation. First of all, let's talk about the variety of life on Earth. I have a little diagram over here that shows you just some of the different living things, some of the wide variety out there. There's many, many more out here, but this gives you a real general idea of how living things are related to one another. Some stuff we'll talk about a lot more later on. So species that have been identified on Earth so far, eukaryotes, so complex celled organisms, usually multicellular, but not always. There's been almost 2 million of those that have been identified so far. So quite a few. And actually, the number of prokaryotes, I've had trouble finding a total on that. But there are hundreds of thousands of different bacterial species that have identified as well. Okay, and when scientists try to estimate how many species there are total, meaning the ones we've discovered and the ones that we haven't discovered, what kind of totals are we looking at? And depending on who you ask, that's somewhere between 10 and 100 million species. Now, these are just estimates, which is why we have such a huge range, because anywhere between 10 and 100 million means 90 million species different. So obviously, scientists have some different ideas about this. Prokaryotes is an even bigger difference. Some people estimate there's about 5 million species of bacteria on Earth. Some people estimate maybe over 1 billion species of bacteria on Earth. Okay, and I've heard that if you get a gallon of water out of the lake or an ocean, you may have 10, 15, 20,000 species of organisms living in there. And most of those are going to be prokaryotes. And that's just in, a small quantity of the Earth's surface. So there are tons and tons and tons of living things on Earth. And part of what we're going to talk about is how we got all this variation. Okay, so variation, what you should have on your notes about it, is that it exists within all species. So no species is made up of clones, whether that be humans or plants or bacteria. You always have some variation within the species. And as we learned about back in Objective 7, variation is always caused by mutations. So when we talk about variation, a lot of what we're talking about is the alleles that you have. 4 traits, maybe you have 2 or more alleles. That's usually where variation starts, and that comes from mutation. Okay, there are 3 main types of variation that we want to talk about that you can see in living things, or at least that you can study. You can't always see them. The first one is behavioral variation. So not every member of the species behaves exactly the same. And behaviors are anything that an organism does. So different hunting behaviors, mating behaviors, and migration behaviors are all examples of that. Dogs have a lot of examples of interesting behaviors. Right now, my dog is sitting right behind the camera, gnawing on, I'm not sure, a cattle femur, I think. But anyway, that's a behavior. Okay, and right now I am talking to you about biology. That's also a behavior. So anything that an organism does is considered behavior. And you do get variation within a species in that. So, some dogs like to chew more than others, and some dogs like to run and play fetch more than others. Some dogs are very territorial. Some dogs are, I don't know, lots of variation just within dogs. Okay, structural variation is what you can see. So that's size of the organism, shape of the organism, color, or any other thing that you might see. Dogs are a great example of that because they're all one species, but you obviously get tons and tons of different shapes and sizes and colors and things like that. So lots and lots of structural variation. The last kind of variation I want to talk about is called physiological. And this, for one thing, is kind of hard to say. It's physiological. And this is kind of like structural stuff. It has to do with an organism's structure, but it has to do with how they function on a microscopic level. So usually looking at an organism, you can't learn a lot about their physiology. You would have to do some more in-depth research and maybe look under a microscope or something like that. But some examples of that are extra mitochondria. Some people can run and run and run and run and run, and they said never seem to get tired even if they haven't been training. That could be because their cells just have some extra mitochondria making ATP in there, and that is an example of a physiological difference. Okay. Another good one is hibernation. Some organisms hibernate. That's not just taking a nap like some people think it is. When an organism hibernates for the winter, its cells actually kind of switch into this low energy mode where they need very little, if anything, to eat, and they also produce very little waste. So they can't really do anything. They're not capable of protecting themselves or hunting, but they burn very little energy during the wintertime, which is great if you can do that when there's not a lot of food around in the winter. So those are the 3 kinds of variation that we discuss. Okay, here's a cool example. All dogs, in case you didn't know, are descended from gray wolves. That's Canis lupus. And you have some older groups of dogs where they came from. So these are some older breeds. And then from some of those you get other dogs. Okay, this is not natural selection. This is not nature making this happen. That's how we got the wolves. But at some point, wolves were domesticated by humans, and then humans started breeding dogs for specific purposes. So sometimes you wanted big dogs, sometimes you wanted small dogs. Sometimes you wanted dogs with long hair for cold weather, or short weather or short hair for hot weather. But either way, you get a ton of variation. And most of what you're seeing there is structural variation, at least you can see. If you looked at the different behaviors of these dogs, different things they did, then that would give you behavioral variation. Okay, here's kind of a cool little example that shows you height distribution in people in the United States. The blue is men, the purple is women. You can see that most people fall within this 5'5" to 6 foot category. Okay, and that is where most people fall. We do have some out here, some really short people. You'll see almost all of them are women. And then at the really tall end of the spectrum, you'll see that we have mostly men, but you do have a few men that are taller than that 6 foot range. But they're not nearly as common as men who are in this range. And I believe, at least in our country, the average for men is somewhere between 5'9" and 5'10", and for women it is somewhere between 5'5" and 5'6". So, just in case you're wondering. All right, so that's variation and inheritance. They were in a different order, but that's okay. I switched them around because I thought inheritance would be a good place to start because we'd already talked about that. So first two things you have to see in a species in order for it to change is you have to have variation, so they can't all be the same. You're going to have structural variations, you're going to have behavioral variations, and you're also going to have physiological variations. And then the other thing you need to see is inheritance. They have to be able to pass their genes on to the next generation, or else they're not going to be able to reproduce, much less change over time. Okay, so make sure you have all your notes filled in. If you have any questions, write them down on your notes or put them in email and send them along to this guy. Thanks for watching.